You know that feeling when you're scrolling through your phone at night and you realize there's nobody you actually want to call? Not because you don't have numbers saved, but because somewhere along the way, real connection started feeling like a foreign language you forgot how to speak. Here's what most people don't understand about loneliness. It's not always about being physically alone. It's about that suffocating silence inside you that whispers you could disappear tomorrow, and most people wouldn't notice until days or maybe weeks later. That's the kind of isolation that rewires everything. The psychology behind having no friends is far more complex than society wants to admit. It's not that you're broken or fundamentally flawed as a human being. What's actually happening is your brain has learned to associate connection with danger, rejection with inevitability, and solitude with survival. Think about that for a moment. Your nervous system might be protecting you from the very thing you crave most. If this resonates with your experience, hit that like button and drop a comment sharing your honest thoughts about loneliness, because your story matters more than you know. Let's talk about what loneliness actually does to your brain on a neurological level. When you experience prolonged social isolation, your brain doesn't just feel sad. It activates the same neural regions associated with physical pain and bodily threat. Neuroscientists have discovered that chronic loneliness triggers your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, making you hypervigilant to social cues and perceived rejection. This creates a psychological paradox where you desperately want connection, but simultaneously scan every interaction for signs of danger or disappointment. The concept of learned social helplessness explains why after enough failed attempts at friendship, your brain stops trying altogether. Just like the psychological experiments where animals learned that their actions couldn't change outcomes, humans experiencing repeated social rejection develop unconscious avoidance patterns. Your cognitive system associates reaching out with pain, so it builds protective walls disguised as preference for solitude. You tell yourself you're fine alone, but deep inside there's still that quiet aching for someone who truly understands your inner world without needing explanations or performance. Here's something fascinating about people who have no friends. They often possess extraordinary emotional depth and heightened sensitivity to human behavior patterns. Years spent observing from the outside create remarkable psychological awareness. You notice micro-expressions others miss. You sense emotional incongruence when someone's words don't match their energy. You understand authenticity versus performance because you've analyzed social dynamics from every possible angle. This cognitive complexity becomes both gift and curse, making surface-level interactions feel exhausting while deeper connections feel terrifyingly vulnerable. Social neuroscience reveals that isolation fundamentally alters your perception of time itself. When you have nobody to share moments with, your subjective experience of time slows dramatically. Days blur together because human memory encodes experiences more vividly when they're shared and validated by others. Without that social mirroring, your autobiographical memory becomes fragmented and isolated events lack the emotional weight that makes them feel significant. This is why loneliness doesn't just hurt emotionally, but creates an existential heaviness that's difficult to articulate to people who've never experienced prolonged isolation. The psychological defense mechanism of preemptive rejection is something most lonely people develop without conscious awareness. Your brain learns to reject yourself before others get the chance, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that confirms your deepest fears. You become hypervigilant to any sign of disinterest, interpreting neutral responses as rejection and kind gestures as temporary politeness. Cognitive behavioral research shows this negativity bias intensifies with isolation, making your brain literally wired to expect social pain rather than social reward or genuine human warmth. What's truly heartbreaking is how loneliness affects your internal dialogue and self-concept over time. Without external validation and social mirroring, your inner voice becomes the only narrative shaping your identity. For many people experiencing chronic isolation, this voice grows increasingly critical and harsh. You internalize the silence as evidence of your unworthiness rather than recognizing the complex interplay of circumstance, past trauma, psychological patterns, and sometimes just terrible timing that contributed to your current situation and emotional landscape. The neuroscience of social connection reveals something profound about human psychology and evolutionary biology. Your brain literally developed to function within tribal communities and social networks. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for complex reasoning and emotional regulation, requires social interaction to develop fully and maintain optimal functioning. Prolonged isolation doesn't just cause emotional suffering, but can actually lead to cognitive changes, including decreased empathy, reduced emotional regulation, and altered stress response patterns that make future connection even more challenging psychologically. Here's where Stoic philosophy offers unexpected wisdom for understanding isolation and building psychological resilience. The ancient Stoics taught radical acceptance of what lies beyond your control while focusing energy on your internal responses and personal growth. When you've experienced chronic loneliness, this philosophical framework helps separate your inherent worth from external circumstances. You're not less valuable because you're alone. You're simply in a particular chapter of your human experience that requires different wisdom and internal strength than chapters filled with easy social connection and external validation. Cognitive psychology identifies something called the loneliness loop, a vicious cycle where isolation increases social anxiety, which increases avoidance behavior, which deepens isolation further. Breaking this pattern requires conscious intervention and gradually exposing yourself to low-stakes social situations, while simultaneously working on your internal narrative. The goal isn't forcing yourself into uncomfortable social performance, but gently reconditioning your nervous system to recognize that connection doesn't always equal pain, and vulnerability doesn't automatically result in rejection or abandonment. The psychological concept of social self-concept explains why prolonged loneliness distorts how you imagine others perceive you. When you lack regular social feedback, you fill that void with assumptions often colored by past hurts and cognitive distortions. You imagine people see you as awkward or boring or too much when the reality is most people are too absorbed in their own insecurities to judge you as harshly as you judge yourself. This metacognitive awareness, understanding how you think about how others think, becomes crucial for healing isolation patterns. Existential psychology offers a different lens for understanding the pain of having no friends. Philosophers like Sartre and Camus explored how humans create meaning through relationships and shared experience. When you're isolated, you face the raw existential reality of your individual consciousness without the comforting buffer of social validation and collective meaning-making. This can feel terrifying but also potentially transformative if you develop the philosophical frameworks to sit with that discomfort and find authentic purpose beyond external approval and social performance metrics. The psychology of attachment theory reveals how early childhood experiences with caregivers shape your adult relationship patterns and friendship capabilities. If you experienced inconsistent emotional availability, dismissive responses to your needs, or traumatic relational wounds during formative years, your nervous system learned that connection is unreliable or dangerous. These implicit memories operate beneath conscious awareness, sabotaging adult friendships through defensive behaviors you don't even recognize you're doing until you develop psychological insight and potentially therapeutic support. Research on neuroplasticity offers genuine hope for people experiencing chronic isolation and social anxiety. Your brain retains the capacity to form new neural pathways throughout your entire lifespan. This means the patterns that currently keep you isolated aren't permanent neurological fixtures, but learned responses that can be gradually reshaped through consistent small actions. Each tiny moment of authentic connection, even brief eye contact or genuine small talk, begins rewiring your brain's social reward circuits and reconditioning your threat response system. The philosophical concept of radical self-compassion becomes essential medicine for healing isolation wounds. Buddhist psychology and modern therapeutic approaches both emphasize treating yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a struggling friend. When your inner voice says you're unworthy of friendship, practice responding with gentle curiosity rather than harsh judgment. Ask yourself what past experiences taught you this belief. Challenge whether it's objectively true or just a cognitive distortion created by prolonged isolation and accumulated disappointments over time. Here's something crucial about the journey from isolation to connection that psychology research consistently demonstrates. Healing doesn't follow a linear path forward. You'll have days where social interaction feels possible and hopeful, followed by weeks where the old protective patterns resurface strongly. This isn't failure or regression, but the natural rhythm of nervous system regulation and psychological growth. The key is continuing to show up for yourself with patience and compassion, even when progress feels invisible and the loneliness feels overwhelming again. If you're someone who currently has no friends, I want you to hear this clearly. Your isolation doesn't define your worth as a human being or predict your future capacity for meaningful connection. What you're experiencing is a complex interplay of psychological patterns, past experiences, nervous system conditioning, and circumstances that created this particular moment in your life story. But this moment isn't your entire story. Understanding the neuroscience and psychology behind your loneliness is the first step toward healing those patterns and creating space for authentic relationships when you're ready. The path forward isn't about forcing yourself into shallow social performance or pretending you're someone you're not to gain approval. It's about gradually rebuilding trust in yourself and in the possibility of genuine human connection. Start small with low-stakes interactions. Practice self-compassion when old protective patterns resurface. Consider whether professional support might help you process underlying wounds. And remember that the depth you've developed through years of solitude, while painful, also makes you capable of extraordinarily meaningful friendships once you find people who recognize and value that depth. If these insights resonated with your experience, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or struggles with loneliness. Subscribe for more content exploring the hidden psychology of human behavior, philosophical wisdom for modern challenges, and practical frameworks for personal transformation. Your story and your healing matter to this community.